A truck driver finds a shivering little girl on the highway, and what she confesses makes him immediately call 911. The bitter winter evening stretched across an endless expanse of farmland, snow falling steadily from a steel-grey sky. It collected on the shoulders of the empty highway, creating a stark white contrast against the dark asphalt. Orson's refrigerated truck cut through the desolate landscape, its engine humming steadily against the growing storm. The truck's dashboard showed the outside temperature dropping steadily below -10 degrees Celsius. Orson had been driving for hours, his eyes fixed on the seemingly endless road ahead. The monotony of the journey was suddenly interrupted by the vibration of his phone against the cup holder. His boss's name flashed on the screen, causing his stomach to tighten. He knew that a call from the boss rarely brought good news, especially on a day like this. With a deep sigh, Orson answered the call, already anticipating the demands to come. The boss's voice crackled through the speaker, sharp and impatient. "Orson, we've got 2 urgent deliveries in that cargo you drive. I need you to step on it. Drive faster." Orson's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he listened to the details. First, there was a shipment of fresh produce for the distributors. Nothing unusual there. But then came the kicker: wedding flowers, specially requested by the boss's best friend. The boss's tone left no room for excuses or delays, as he emphasized repeatedly that the flowers could not be late. "I don't care if you have to drive through a blizzard, Orson. Those flowers need to be there on time. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Orson replied, his voice flat and resigned. "I'll make sure it gets done." As the call ended, Orson's thoughts turned dark. The cab of the truck filled with the sound of his voice as he began ranting to himself, years of accumulated bitterness spilling out into the confined space. 15 years of this. Am I the stupidest man alive or what? He muttered, gripping the steering wheel even tighter. Lost my family, my marriage, all to be at the beck and call of a man who couldn't care less about me. His mind wandered to scenarios of growing old alone, imagining himself dying in this very truck seat with no one to notice or care. The thought of how quickly his boss would replace him if illness or accident rendered him unable to drive sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the winter cold outside. "Just another disposable part in the machine," he growled, his words barely audible over the hum of the engine. As if the universe was listening to his complaints and decided to pile on, the gas indicator suddenly blinked on, its red glow adding to Orson's mounting frustration. "Perfect, just perfect," he growled, calculating the 20-minute drive to the next station. The farmland stretched endlessly on both sides, the winter wind picking up speed across the open fields. Orson settled in for the drive, his mood as dark as the storm clouds gathering overhead. As Orson continued down the highway, the snow began to fall more heavily, reducing visibility with each passing minute. He leaned forward in his seat, squinting through the windshield as the wipers worked overtime to clear the accumulating snow. Suddenly, through the thickening white curtain, Orson caught a glimpse of something that didn't belong, a splash of pink against the white landscape. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, a result of the monotonous drive and the stress of the day, but as he drew closer, the pink blur began to take shape. To his disbelief, Orson made out the figure of a young girl, no more than 13 years old, wearing only a thin pink dress that barely reached her knees. She was waving frantically, her entire body trembling violently in the brutal cold. The sight was so incongruous with the desolate winter landscape that for a moment Orson wondered if he was hallucinating. As the truck neared the girl, Orson's foot hovered over the brake pedal. Multiple thoughts raced through his mind, creating a cacophony of conflicting voices in his head. His boss's urgent demands echoed in his ears, reminding him of the tight deadline he was already struggling to meet. Years of experience on the road screamed caution. She could be bait for a trap, a scam, or worse. The cargo deadline loomed large in his consciousness, a constant pressure pushing him forward. "Can't get involved," he muttered, his hand tightening on the steering wheel. "Not my problem. Need to make that delivery." Even as he spoke the words, a part of him rebelled against the coldness of his decision, but the pragmatic, survival-oriented part of his brain, the part that had kept him employed and out of trouble for 15 years, won out. Instead of slowing down, Orson pressed down on the accelerator. In an attempt to drown out his conscience, Orson deliberately turned up the radio volume. The cab filled with the sounds of an old country song, the singer's twangy voice singing about lost love and loneliness. It seemed a fitting soundtrack to the moment. As he passed the girl, Orson couldn't help but glance in his rearview mirror. Her small figure grew smaller, but the image burned itself into his mind. Her desperate wave, the thin pink dress whipping in the wind, the visible trembling of her frame. He tried to shake off the guilt that was already beginning to gnaw at him, focusing instead on the road ahead and the job he had to do. But even as the miles stretched between him and the girl in pink, Orson couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a terrible mistake. The image of her desperate face haunted him, a silent accusation that no amount of radio noise could drown out. After a half-hour drive that felt much longer, the petrol station appeared through the snow like a fluorescent oasis. The harsh lights cut through the falling snow, creating a hazy glow that seemed almost otherworldly in the whiteout conditions. Orson felt a wave of relief as he pulled up to the pump, the familiar routine offering a welcome distraction from his troubled thoughts. His movements were mechanical as he filled the tank, the cold biting at his exposed skin. Once the tank was full, he closed the petrol cap and made his way inside the station. The warmth hit him as soon as he opened the door, a stark contrast to the frigid air outside. He headed straight for the restroom, eager to splash some cold water on his face and clear his head. As he pushed open the restroom door, he heard two men's voices coming from inside. He was about to turn back when a fragment of their conversation caught his attention. "Did you see that girl in the pink dress standing by the road?" one man asked. "Yeah, strange sight," the other replied, "especially in this weather." Orson froze, his hand still on the door handle. He listened intently as the conversation continued. "You didn't stop, did you?" the first man asked. "Nah," came the reply. "Weather's troubling enough without picking up strays. Probably just bring more trouble." The first man chuckled. "Smart move. For all we know, she could be some kind of lure. You hear stories, you know. Country club or worse, scam." Orson's stomach churned at their callous words. He wanted to burst in to confront them about their indifference, but before he could move, the men's conversation shifted to other topics, and he heard them washing their hands. Quickly, Orson stepped away from the door and busied himself at a nearby vending machine. The two men exited the restroom, barely sparing him a glance as they left the station. Once they were gone, Orson entered the restroom. He splashed cold water on his face, but it did little to wash away the discomfort he felt. As he looked at his reflection in the mirror, he was troubled by how easily those men had dismissed a child in need. But then, a more uncomfortable thought struck him. Was he any better? He too had driven past the girl, leaving her alone in the cold. The realization sat heavy in his chest, a weight of guilt he couldn't shake off. Orson dried his face, his movements slow and deliberate as he wrestled with his conscience. He had told himself he was just doing his job, that he couldn't get involved. But hearing those men, seeing his own actions reflected in their indifference, made him question everything. With a heavy sigh, he left the restroom and went through his usual routine, paying for gas, ordering a cup of coffee, purchasing a cup noodle, and filling his thermos with hot water. The cashier, a bored-looking teenager, barely looked up from her phone as she rang up his purchases. Orson found himself envying her apparent lack of concern for the world outside the station's walls. With his supplies in hand, Orson returned to his truck. He settled into the driver's seat, the familiar smell of diesel and leather offering a small comfort. As he waited for his noodles to cook, he pulled out his phone and began scrolling through the news, more out of habit than any real interest. Suddenly, a headline stopped his scrolling. "Child dies after consuming yellow snow." The words hit him like a physical blow, and suddenly, the image of the girl in pink flooded back into his mind with startling clarity. As he read the tragic details of the child's death, the noodles turned tasteless in his mouth, guilt gnawing at his conscience. Orson tried to push the thoughts away to focus on the task at hand, but the more he tried to ignore it, the more insistent the memory became. He could see the girl's desperate face, feel the biting cold that must have been tormenting her thin frame. The warmth of the truck cab and his noodle cup suddenly felt oppressive, almost mocking in its comfort. Unable to shake the growing unease, Orson quickly finished his meal. His hands shook slightly as he started the engine, his mind already calculating the route back. He tried to rationalize his decision. He would just check on the girl, returned her to where she came, make sure she was okay, or called the police to deal with her. He wouldn't linger long. Despite his boss's demands echoing in his head, despite the tight deadline and the consequences he might face, Orson turned the truck around, heading back the way he came. As he pulled out of the station and back onto the snow-covered highway, Orson couldn't help but wonder if he was making a huge mistake. But deep down, he knew that the real mistake had been driving past in the first place. Whatever consequences he might face, they couldn't be worse than the weight of guilt he'd carry if he didn't go back. With a deep breath, Orson pressed down on the accelerator, his eyes scanning the road ahead. He only hoped he wasn't too late. As Orson retraced his route, the storm intensified. Snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, reducing visibility to mere meters ahead. His wipers worked frantically against the accumulating snow, creating a hypnotic rhythm that matched the pounding of Orson's heart. He carefully watched his odometer, trying to pinpoint where he had seen the girl. The landscape looked different now, transformed by the relentless snowfall into an alien world of white. Doubt began to creep in. Had he imagined the whole thing? Was he risking his job, his livelihood, for nothing more than a stress-induced hallucination? But then, after what felt like an eternity, but was really only 30 minutes of backtracking, he spotted it. A flash of pink against the endless white. Relief flooded through him, quickly followed by a surge of fear. She hadn't moved a single inch from her original spot. It almost seems like she was frozen, an icy statue at the roadside. Orson pulled the truck over to the side of the road, the tires crunching through the fresh snow. He jumped out, the bitter cold hitting him like a physical blow. As he approached the girl, he realized with horror how much her condition had deteriorated. Her dark skin had taken on a dangerous blue tinge, her hair white with accumulated snow. Her toes and fingernails showed signs of blackening from the cold, and she was barely standing, her thin frame racked with violent shivers. The sight filled Orson with a mixture of guilt and urgency. Moving quickly, he retrieved his thermos from the truck. With gentle encouragement, he helped the girl take small sips of the warm liquid. Then, without hesitation, he removed his green jacket, wrapping it securely around her trembling shoulders. The girl clutched at the fabric, her frozen fingers struggling to grip the zipper. Thinking practically, Orson retrieved a folded chair from his truck, setting it up to keep her feet off the snow-covered ground. As he helped her sit, he tried to get information from her. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Where's your home? Are you lost?" Each question was met with either head shakes or frightened looks. When he mentioned calling for help, terror flashed across her face. Through chattering teeth, she managed only fragmented phrases. "Sister, Haley, danger, and Dad bad." The words were barely audible but filled with unmistakable fear. Orson's mind raced, trying to piece together the girl's story from these cryptic clues. Whatever her situation was, it was clear that it went beyond simply being lost in the storm. As he contemplated his next move, Orson realized that his simple act of kindness had led him into a situation far more complex and potentially dangerous than he could have imagined. Just as Orson reached for his phone, intent on calling emergency services despite the girl's apparent fear, movement caught his eye. Through the swirling snow, he saw a figure emerging from the snowy field. As it drew closer, Orson made out a white man in farmer's attire, doubled in a winter coat and carrying a shovel. The man's initial expression was dark and threatening, his eyes fixed on Orson with a look that sent a chill down the truck driver's spine. But in the blink of an eye, the expression transformed with unsettling speed into a friendly smile. The abrupt change set off alarm bells in Orson's mind. "Well, hello there," the man called out, his voice jovial but with an undercurrent of tension. "I'm Tom. Thanks for looking out for Belle here. We've been searching everywhere for her." Orson felt the girl, Belle, stiffen beside him. He kept a protective hand on her shoulder as Tom approached. "We live in that farm over yonder," Tom continued, gesturing vaguely toward a distant property. His words came too quickly, too smoothly, as if rehearsed. "It's a cold one today, isn't it? Had to keep all the livestock indoors, didn't expect to find anyone out here in this weather." Orson nodded cautiously. "I'm a truck driver," he explained, keeping his voice level. "I saw Belle as I drove past and was concerned. It's not weather for anyone to be out in, let alone a young girl." Tom's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, you know kids, always getting into mischief. Belle here decided to go looking for white bunnies, despite her mother's warnings. Isn't that right, Belle?" Belle didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the ground. Tom's grip on her arm tightened visibly, causing her to flinch. "Well, we should be getting back," Tom said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Thanks again for your help, Mr. Orson," he supplied, reluctant to give his full name. "Are you sure you don't need any assistance getting home? I'd be happy to give you a ride in my truck." Tom's smile became strained. "That won't be necessary, we're not far. Best you get back on the road before it gets more slippery. There's a rest area not far from here if you need to stop." Orson nodded, recognizing the dismissal. "Right, the petrol station, that's where I came from." As Tom began to lead Belle away, Orson noticed how the girl seemed to shrink into herself at his touch. Her body language spoke volumes, contradicting Tom's friendly demeanor and casual explanations. Orson watched as Tom forced Belle to return his jacket and thermos, his grip on her arm never loosening. The explanation about her wandering off to look for white bunnies rang hollow, especially given the terror Orson had seen in her eyes earlier. As they disappeared into the swirling snow, Orson couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed something deeply wrong. The image of Belle's frightened face stayed with him as he climbed back into his truck, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts and growing concern. As Orson started driving again, his mind was a whirlwind of worry and indecision. He had barely gone a mile when his phone rang, the sound cutting through the tense silence of the cab. His boss's name flashed on the screen, causing Orson's stomach to drop. With a deep breath, he answered the call. "Hello, sir?" His boss's voice came through sharp with anger. "Orson, what the hell is going on? I've been monitoring the truck's GPS tracker. Why did you backtrack after the gas station? You're already behind schedule." Orson winced at the fury in his boss's tone. He opened his mouth to explain the situation with Belle, but his boss cut him off before he could get a word out. "I don't want to hear excuses," the man snapped. "You cannot be late to deliver those flowers. The distributor has been calling non-stop about the produce. Do you have any idea how much money we stand to lose if you don't make these deliveries on time?" "I understand, sir, but there was a situation." "I don't care about situations, Orson. I care about results. Do you know why you're my most reliable man? It's because you have no other family responsibilities. That's what makes you always available and quick. I don't need you dealing with other people's business. It's not good news to me, and I don't want any more interruptions after this. Is that clear?" Orson's jaw clenched, but he forced himself to respond calmly. "Yes, sir, it's clear." "Good, now get moving. I expect those deliveries to be on time." The call ended abruptly, leaving Orson in stunned silence. As he drove on, alone in the truck cab, his mind filled with memories he'd rather forget. His time as a drug cartel driver flashed before his eyes, the constant fear, the moral compromises, the police sting that led to his arrest. He thought about losing his family during his imprisonment, his daughter lost to divorce, his ex-wife who couldn't handle his chosen profession. 15 years of trying to live an honest life, redeeming himself through legitimate work, all hanging by a thread because of one act of compassion. The irony wasn't lost on Orson. The very qualities that made him valuable to his boss were the result of his past mistakes and losses. As the miles rolled by, Orson found himself at a crossroads. On one side lay the path of least resistance. Follow orders, make the deliveries, keep his job. On the other, a nagging sense that something was deeply wrong back at that farm, that Belle needed help. The weight of his decision pressed down on him, heavier than any cargo he'd ever hauled. With each passing mile, the image of Belle's frightened face grew more vivid in his mind, haunting him with the possibility that he might be leaving her to a terrible fate. Finally, unable to bear the guilt any longer, Orson made a decision that he knew might cost him everything. He pulled the truck over to the side of the road, the engine idling as he sat in silence for a moment, gathering his resolve. Then, with a deep breath, he put the truck in gear and made a U-turn, heading back towards the farm. Whatever consequences he might face, he knew he couldn't live with himself if he didn't at least try to help. Despite the deteriorating weather conditions, thick fog limiting visibility, and ice making the road treacherous, Orson couldn't shake his unease. The image of Belle's frightened face haunted him, overriding his boss's angry words and the potential consequences of his actions. The journey back to the farm seemed to take an eternity. The weather had worsened, thick fog limiting visibility to mere feet in front of the truck, and ice making the road treacherous. Orson gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with tension as he navigated the dangerous conditions. As he neared the farm, Orson couldn't help but reflect on the absurdity of his situation. Here he was, a truck driver with a criminal past, potentially throwing away his job and his shot at redemption, all for a girl he'd met briefly on the side of the road. And yet something in his gut told him he was doing the right thing. Finally, the vague outline of the farmhouse appeared through the swirling snow. Orson parked his truck a short distance away, not wanting to alert anyone to his presence. He took a moment to check on his cargo, ensuring the refrigeration unit was still running to keep the flowers fresh and the produce from spoiling. Then, steeling himself for whatever might come next, he set out towards the farm. The farmhouse loomed dark and silent in the storm, a foreboding silhouette against the white landscape. Orson's knocking went unanswered, the windows dark and lifeless. He looked around, seeing no signs of life or movement. The eerie silence, broken only by the howling wind, sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "Where are they?" he muttered. "Surely there should be someone here, at least that farmer." Just as he was about to give up and return to his truck, a faint sound caught his attention. It was coming from a large structure off to the side of the main house, a chicken coop as big as a small warehouse. Orson approached cautiously, the sound growing clearer as he drew near. It was unmistakable now. Someone was crying out for help. Orson tried the main door of the warehouse, but it was locked tight. Undeterred, he circled the building, searching for another way in. At the back, he found a door that yielded to his push, swinging open with a rusty creak. The interior of the warehouse was dimly lit and filled with the rustling and clucking of hundreds of chickens. Orson made his way down the rows of cages, following the sound of distress. What he found made his blood run cold. In one of the cages, huddled in a corner, was a black woman. Her clothes were torn and dirty, and she reeked of urine. When she saw Orson, her eyes widened with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "please help me." Orson didn't hesitate. He looked around frantically for something to break the lock with, finally spotting a rusted metal beam in one corner of the coop. He grabbed it and returned to the cage, using all his strength to smash the lock. It took several attempts, but finally, the lock gave way with a satisfying crack. As the woman crawled out of the cage, she broke down in tears. "Thank you," she sobbed. "Thank you so much." "It's okay," Orson said, trying to keep his voice calm despite the horror of the situation. "You're safe now. Can you tell me your name? I'm Orson." "Myrna," she replied, her voice shaking. "My name is Myrna. My daughters, my 2 little girls. My husband took them." "Your husband, is his name Tom?" Orson asked, picturing the man in his mind. "Yes, he's my new husband. We've only been married a month. He seemed so kind at first, offering to help run the farm after my late husband died. But then he changed. He took over everything, the farm, our lives." Then she looked at him. "Have you met my husband, sir? You seem to know him." Orson thought about his words. How could he tell this woman about the girl in pink dress? Well, I'm a truck driver. I was just passing the highway when I saw a young girl in pink dress. Long story short, I stopped by and checked on her. Then Tom, your husband, approached us. Grace, did she escape? Escape? Is that what you think she's doing? I found her at the roadside and Tom took her back to the house. Orson's mind reeled at the revelation. But the house was dark and locked when I checked earlier, he said. Do you know where they might be? Myrna's eyes widened with fear. The barn, she whispered. He must have taken them to the barn. We have to help them, but we need to be quiet. Tom, he's dangerous when he's angry. As they made their way out of the coupe, Orson couldn't help but ask, why didn't you call the police before now? Myrna's face crumpled with shame and fear. I was scared, she confessed. Tom, he has this way of making you believe things will get better. He kept promising he'd change if I just gave him more time. He's not always like that. We have good days too, sometimes, but when things got bad, I was terrified of what he might do to the girls if I tried to get help. A part of me still hoped he could change. Orson shook his head, his expression grim. Myrna, I've worked with the worst of men in the past. I've seen what they're capable of, he said, his voice low, hinting at his time in the drug cartel. What Tom's doing. It's too far gone. When a man has sunk this deep into darkness, he rarely, if ever, changes. Myrna looked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and dawning realization. You sound like you know from experience. Orson nodded slowly. I do, and trust me. Waiting for someone like that to change is like waiting for the sun to rise at midnight. It's not going to happen. We need to get your girls out of there now. But what if... Myrna started, but Orson cut her off gently. No what-ifs, he said firmly. Your daughters need you to be strong right now. We have to focus on getting them to safety. Can you do that? Myrna took a deep breath, then nodded, her resolve visibly strengthening. Yes, I can. You're right. No more waiting. We need to save my girls. That's the spirit, Orson said, offering a reassuring smile. Now let's go. Show me where the barn is and we'll figure out how to get them out. Together they left the chicken warehouse, stepping out into the cold night. Myrna led the way, guiding Orson toward the barn. They moved cautiously, ducking behind barrels and crates, each step filled with the fear of being discovered should Tom happen to walk by. As they neared the barn, a sound cut through the howling wind, the unmistakable sound of children crying. Orson and Myrna exchanged a look of determination. Whatever happened next, they knew they had to act fast to save the girls. Orson and Myrna crouched behind a stack of crates near the barn. The cries from inside grew more distinct. Orson could make out two different voices, one he recognized as Belle's and another that must belong to her sister. The desperation in their cries made his heart clench. We need to get in there, Orson whispered to Myrna, but we need to be smart about this. Tom could be armed. Myrna nodded, her face a mask of fear and determination. There's a side door, she whispered back. It's usually unlocked. We might be able to slip in unnoticed. They made their way around the barn, keeping low and moving as quietly as possible through the snow. The side door was indeed unlocked, and Orson carefully eased it open. Despite his efforts to be silent, the rusted hinges groaned with every slight movement, each creak echoing in the stillness of the cold night. The interior of the barn was dimly lit by a single bare bulb, casting long shadows across the hay-strewn floor. Orson's eyes took a moment to adjust, but when they did, the scene before him made his blood run cold. Tom stood in the center of the barn, a pitchfork gripped tightly in his hands. Belle lay face down on the dirty floor, unmoving, while her sister, Haley, Orson recalled, was chained to one of the stalls, her eyes wide with terror. The livestock shuffled restlessly around them, adding to the tense, eerie silence. You, the truck driver, should have just driven away like I told you, Tom snarled, his eyes wild with anger. When Myrna appeared behind Orson, Tom let out a cold laugh. Ah, and the bitch, looks like you're picking yourself a new husband, huh? Orson raised his hands slowly, trying to appear non-threatening. "Easy now, Tom," he said, his voice calm despite the fear coursing through him. "You don't want to do this. Think about what you're doing." "Don't move," Tom growled, pressing his pitchfork into the ground near the girl. Grace squealed, her eyes wide with fear. "One more step and I'll hurt her, I swear I will." Okay. Orson kept his hand raised in the air. "Let's just talk." "Talk?" Tom's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Look at you, you don't even know what you got yourself into. You don't know anything about what I want," he spat. "This is my farm now, my family. You have no right to be here." "It's not your farm, Tom," Myrna said, her voice shaking but strong. "And they're not your family. Please, just let the girls go. We can talk about this." Tom's grip on the pitchfork tightened, his knuckles white. "Shut up," he roared. "You ungrateful woman, after everything I've done for you." The situation was escalating rapidly, and Orson knew he had to act. He began to inch forward, hoping to distract Tom long enough for Myrna to reach the girls. "Tom," he said, keeping his voice steady, "you're right. I don't know what you want. Why don't you tell me? Maybe we can work something out." For a moment it seemed like Tom might be considering Orson's words, but then his face twisted with rage. "No," he shouted. "No more talking. You'll all do what I say, or I'll—" He never got to finish his threat. In that moment of distraction, Orson lunged forward, tackling Tom to the ground. The pitchfork clattered away as they grappled on the dirty barn floor. Tom fought like a man possessed, his fists connecting with Orson's face and body. But Orson had size and desperation on his side. He managed to pin Tom down, using all his strength to keep the struggling man immobilized. "Myrna!" Orson shouted. "Get the girls and run! Call the police!" Myrna didn't hesitate. She rushed to Belle, helping her to her feet, then worked frantically to free Haley from her chains, but it was locked. "I'm so sorry, darling. I'll come back for you, I promise." Myrna, with tears in her eyes, made her escape from the side door. Grace clung to her mother, sobbing with relief and fear. As Myrna led the girls out of the barn, Orson continued to struggle with Tom. The fight seemed to last an eternity, each man giving everything he had. Orson could taste blood in his mouth, feel the ache of forming bruises, but he refused to let go. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the sound of sirens cut through the thin, cold air. Tom's struggles became more frantic, but Orson held on, knowing help was on the way. The barn door burst open, and suddenly the space was filled with shouting police officers. Orson felt Tom being pulled away from him, heard the click of handcuffs. As he lay on the barn floor, gasping for breath, he saw Tom being led away, still shouting and struggling. A paramedic knelt beside Orson, checking him for injuries. "You're a brave man," the paramedic said, helping Orson to sit up. "Foolish, maybe, but brave." Orson managed a weak smile. "Sometimes," he said, wincing at the pain in his ribs, "you've got to be a little foolish to do the right thing." As he was led out of the barn, Orson saw Myrna and the girls huddled together, wrapped in blankets. When Belle saw him, she broke away from her mother and ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist. "Thank you," she sobbed. "Thank you for coming back." Orson patted her head gently, feeling a lump form in his throat. "You're welcome, kiddo," he said softly. "You're safe now. It's all over." As the police and paramedics swarmed the farm, Orson knew that his ordeal was far from over. There would be statements to give, possibly charges to face for trespassing and assault. His job was almost certainly lost. But looking at Belle's face, seeing the relief and gratitude there, he knew he'd made the right choice. Whatever came next, he'd face it, knowing he'd done something good. Something that mattered. In the hours that followed, the farm became a hive of activity. Police officers swarmed the property, collecting evidence and taking statements. Paramedics tended to the injured, their ambulances casting eerie red and blue lights across the snow-covered landscape. Orson found himself sitting in the back of one of the ambulances, wincing as a paramedic cleaned the cuts on his face and checked him for more serious injuries. His body ached from the fight with Tom, but the pain seemed distant, overshadowed by the relief of knowing that Myrna and her daughters were safe. As the paramedic finished bandaging a particularly nasty cut on his forehead, Orson saw Myrna approaching. Her face was tear-stained, but filled with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her voice soft. Orson managed a small smile. "I've been better," he admitted, "but I'll live. How are the girls?" "They're shaken up, but they'll be okay," Myrna said. "The paramedics are checking them over now. I don't know how to thank you for what you did. You risked everything to help us." Orson shook his head. "There's no need for thanks. I'm just glad I could help." Myrna reached out, taking Orson's hand in both of hers. "Please stay with us tonight," she said. "It's the least we can do. You shouldn't be alone after everything that's happened." For a moment Orson was tempted. The thought of a warm bed and a home-cooked meal was incredibly appealing after the night's events. But then reality set in. He thought about his truck, about the deliveries waiting to be made. "I appreciate the offer," he said gently, "but I have to decline. I'm a truck driver, and I have deliveries to make. People are counting on me." Myrna nodded, understanding but clearly disappointed. "Will you at least come back to visit? The girls would love to see you again, to thank you properly when all this has settled down." Orson smiled. "I'd like that. I take this route regularly, so I'll make sure to stop by next time I'm passing through." As Myrna turned to go back to her daughters, Orson's gaze fell on Belle. She was wrapped in a blanket, being examined by a paramedic. In the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles, Orson finally got a clear look at her face. Understanding dawned on him like a physical blow. Belle's resemblance to his own daughter was striking. They were about the same age with dark eyes and similar skin tone, explaining the inexplicable pull he had felt to help her on the road. The moment was brief but powerful, bringing a lump to Orson's throat. Belle caught his eye and gave him a small smile. It was a far cry from the terrified girl he had encountered on the road, her eyes now showing trust instead of fear. She mouthed a silent thank you before being led away by the paramedics. As Orson watched her go, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Whatever consequences he might face for his actions tonight, he knew he had done the right thing. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose beyond just making deliveries. A police officer approached, notepad in hand. "Mr. Orson, we need to take your statement now if you're feeling up to it." Orson nodded, steeling himself for the long night ahead. He knew there would be questions to answer, explanations to give, but he was ready to face whatever came next. He had found something tonight that he thought he'd lost long ago, a sense of doing what was right, no matter the cost. As he began to recount the events of the night to the officer, Orson couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, this was the start of a new chapter in his life. One where he could finally begin to make amends for his past and build a future he could be proud of. As the commotion at the farm began to die down, and the police officers taking care of the investigation, Orson made his way back to his truck. The familiar sight of the big rig from afar, oddly comforting after the chaos of the night. When he neared the truck where it was parked, he was startled to see a familiar car parked behind his rig. The snowstorm had calmed, revealing a landscape bathed in the soft light of dawn. There, standing next to the car, was his boss. Orson's heart sank. He had been prepared for an angry phone call, but a face-to-face confrontation was something else entirely. He approached cautiously, bracing himself for the worst. "Sir," Orson began, his voice hesitant, "I can explain." His boss held up a hand, cutting him off. "I drove all the way out here because your truck's been parked for over 3 hours according to the GPS tracker. Couldn't reach you on the phone. Had to come see for myself what was going on." The man's face was unreadable, his tone carefully neutral. Orson took a deep breath. "I'm sorry, sir. There was a girl on the roadside and I had to help." "I saw the police cars," his boss interrupted. "Figured you must have gotten mixed up in whatever's going on at that farm." He jerked his thumb towards the flashing lights in the distance. Orson opened his mouth to explain further, but his boss shook his head. "Save the full story for later. I'll probably end up reading about it in the news anyway." There was a long moment of silence, broken only by the distant sounds of the police and paramedics still working at the farm. Orson stood there, waiting for the axe to fall, for his boss to fire him on the spot. But then something unexpected happened. His boss's stern expression softened slightly, and he let out a long sigh. "Look, Orson, I'm not going to pretend I'm happy about this. The wedding flowers are late. The distributor's calling for discounts because of the delay. It's a loss for the business." Orson nodded, preparing himself for the worst, but his boss wasn't finished. "That being said," the man continued, "I can't say I'm not proud of what you did. Whatever happened over there, it sounds like you showed some real bravery. That counts for something in my book." Orson blinked in surprise. "Sir?" His boss held up a finger. "Don't get me wrong, I'm going to condone this behavior just this once, but there can't be any repetition, you understand? Otherwise, you might as well hang up your keys and become a farmer yourself." A small smile tugged at the corner of Orson's mouth. "Understood, sir. I've been driving for you for 15 years, and I've never been late before." "Then let's make sure this is the only time in 15 years, his boss replied. "Or better yet, the only time ever." He glanced at his watch. "Now the weather's cleared up. Think you can make up for lost time?" Orson nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "Yes, sir. I'll get those deliveries made as fast as I safely can." His boss clapped him on the shoulder. "That's what I like to hear. Get going then. And Orson?" "Yes, sir. Good job tonight. Just don't make a habit of it, all right?" With that, his boss turned and walked back to his car. Orson watched him drive away, still hardly believing what had just happened. He had been prepared to lose everything, and instead he'd found understanding in the most unexpected place. Shaking his head in wonder, Orson climbed into his truck. The familiar rumble of the engine as it started up was comforting, grounding him after the surreal events of the night. He adjusted his mirrors, catching a last glimpse of the farm in the distance. Myrna and the girls were still there, huddled together, watching him. Orson raised a hand in farewell, feeling a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the truck's heater. Whatever came next, he knew he had done something good tonight, something that mattered. As he pulled onto the road, Orson turned up the volume on the radio. An old country song filled the cab, singing about second chances and unexpected blessings. It seemed fitting. The open road stretched out before him, bathed in the golden light of a new day. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world blanketed in pristine white snow. As Orson drove into the dawn, he felt, for the first time in a very long time, a sense of hope for the future. He had faced his fears, done what was right, and somehow, against all odds, come out the other side still standing. There would be challenges ahead, no doubt. But for now, Orson was content to drive, the rhythm of the road beneath his wheels, a reminder that every journey, no matter how difficult, has its purpose. And as the miles rolled by, Orson couldn't help but smile. He had set out to make a delivery, but in the end, he had delivered something far more valuable than flowers or produce. He had delivered hope, safety, and a chance at a new beginning for Myrna and her daughters. Maybe, just maybe, he had delivered a new beginning for himself as well. With that thought warming his heart, Orson pressed down on the accelerator, ready to make up for lost time. The deliveries were waiting, and beyond them, a future full of possibilities. Whatever came next, Orson was ready to face it head-on, with the same courage and determination that had seen him through the night.